volunteering at the local schools in the community outside my college and being exposed really for the first time to the disparity in access to resources and just really high quality teachers and tools to so that students can grow academically. And so Brilla is located in the South Bronx, our flagship campus, and others have grown elsewhere, but it is held the unfortunate statistic for many years now. It is the poorest congressional district in the United States of America. And that continues to still be true to this day. So as you can imagine, and our school is a charter school, it's lottery driven, families choose us, and we have a preference for in district. So almost 100% of our students and families were from the local area. And so many of them were challenged by poverty and all of the challenges that come with that. So this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart that I've spent my career trying to contribute to. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to be brainstorm and talk with all of you about what's working and what we can continue to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And for some reason, yet again, we have technology issues. The recording didn't start. So I did go ahead and start the recording. I will just again say that this is Kelsey LaVigne, who is our author of All In, an Educator's Manual for Winning Hearts, Minds, and High Performance by Intentionally Leading School Culture. And today we're going to be discussing equity versus accountability. So Kelsey, my first question, and I think this is one of those fundamental questions that a lot of people struggle with answering. What is the difference between equity and accountability, and how do we, as educators, how do we make sure that we're focusing in the right areas? And is there one right area, or are we supposed to focus on both?
It's an interesting question. I don't see them as mutually exclusive in the way that they're pit against each other, and that piece. I think there is a visual image that's always really resonated with me of some kids trying to watch a baseball game with a fence in front of them obscuring their view. And it is meant to represent, right? Like the idea that, is giving, you want everybody to be able to see the game. So you give equality would be if you give everybody a box to stand on, but the child who is a little bit shorter wouldn't be able to see over the fence. Equity is when you give every child a box that's the just right size for them so that they all have access to see the game. And then the kind of penultimate goal is liberation, and you just remove the fence completely so that everybody is able to view the game without needing the boxes and supports. But obviously where we are now is not quite there. We're certainly still striving just for the equity piece and giving everyone access to the tools. And I think at that point, if you are truly providing everybody what they need in order to be successful, then it is appropriate to hold them accountable to a standard, because in order to be successful in our context and country, right, there are skills and knowledge that you'll need to be equipped with to navigate a workplace environment and be a productive citizen and all those things. So I feel like if you get equity right, then accountability is appropriate. And if you don't get equity right, then I think accountability is a way of perpetuating a lot of harm.
I 100% agree with you. And I thank you for sharing that. It's funny that you mentioned that image, because I often go back to that image, and I don't know if you guys have had an opportunity to see it, but I'm going to see if I can share it with you. Maybe I can't share it here, but I'm going to try to get creative and see if I can share it. Because I think it's important. So you'll have to ignore me. I'm going to take off my virtual background. And I'm just going to say I have a COVID office, so, bear with me. That's my shoe closet in the background is what you guys are seeing. But this is the image that Kelsey is referring to that talks about equity versus equality, I think. And I really find that that image just resonates, I think, with a lot of people. Um, Tell me a little bit about how you dealt with equity and accountability when you were actually acting as the superintendent in your school district.
Um, so, there's lots of data around kind of the importance of literacy, right? And how reading is the gateway skill to experiencing the world and sharing your gifts and learning and all those things. Um, and they've done studies about, some of the different standardized tests and where students perform on them at a certain grade and how predictive that is of their ability to access college or high paying careers or be out, above the poverty line, et cetera. And so the idea that you can just ignore the accountability piece and not set a bar at where there is evidence to support that a bar needs to be right, or that it is required for the success that we want to see for all kids, I think is naive. So this idea of high expectations and being setting standards for what you hope to see students achieve at different times is appropriate. But then that obviously the key is, how do you give them the tools and resources to be able to meet that bar? Because just saying this is it, here's what you're supposed to achieve, like our job as educators is to help them get there. So we would take a really personalized approach, and in trying to think about my answer to this question, like what concrete tips would I share to this loaded question about how to address the opportunity gap, with the acknowledgement that it's so many different solutions layered on, I think is the real answer. But one key piece is, I think, differentiation and providing people exactly what they need and being creative about how you do that. So for example, at Brilla, when our kindergarten is the first grade in our school network, and some students would come to kindergarten having gone to pre-K, having had their families, spend lots of time reading with them, and they would already have letter recognition. Some would even have letter sounds and be able to sound out some words. And other students might not have had a pre-K experience, or have had that kind of rich exposure to lots of people talking to them or exposing them to work. And so words, excuse me. And so they would be coming into kindergarten not on a level playing field, literally having acquired different amounts of words and the skills that go with this through no fault of their own. And so the bar, the accountability for what you need to have in order to be considered proficient in the kindergarten's, knowledge and skill sequence does not change for those different kids. What does change is what tools and resources and how the school needs to divert those in order to ensure both can meet the bar. So, the student who has more words might be able to be in a slightly larger group setting with their teacher because they are more comfortable with the content that's being taught. They might be able to have enrichment from texts that are a little bit of advanced for the kindergarten level to help keep them growing. Whereas the student who doesn't have the words might need to have a smaller group ratio. They might need to have different types of texts sent home for them to read with their families at night that they can access based on what they have learned so far. We might get for them computer programs that will give them that personalized learning and more at bats with different skills. And so it's just a combination of lots of strategies for differentiation to help the students grow so that both of them can reach the standards that are by and large agreed upon for the different grade levels.
Thank you. That is fantastic. So I just want to pause really quick and just apologize. We were going to be joined by Dr. Alexandra Estrella. She has actually been pulled onto an urgent call and may be late or unable to join, but we will continue moving forward in respect of your time with Kelsey because she is a fantastic expert on this topic. So one of the things that I want to touch on is you wrote your book, All In. So you left being a superintendent to author this book. And one of the things that, again, spoke to me was just a quote that somebody left as a review about your book that I think, kind of relates to this topic. So I just want to read that really quick. And it said, Kelsey LaVigne is absolutely one of the best culture builders I've ever met. I highly encourage all fellow educators and learners to read, study, and leverage All In on behalf of the children and families you serve. The future of our schools would be so much brighter if they reflected the type of visionary, engaging, and high impact culture Kelsey guides her readers to build. And I think that kind of speaks to a lot, right? Because when we talk about equity and we talk about accountability, a lot of what happens, I think, as educators is we don't get to allow our students that we serve to be their full and authentic selves. So, can you talk to me a little bit about your experience with just allowing your students to just grow and thrive and be truly themselves and their authentic selves?
Absolutely. And this was, so you just hit on two of my other concrete tips, right? To how do we address the opportunity gap? One is around relationships with students so that they can be their authentic selves. And the other is around cultivating partnerships with families, because students don't learn in a vacuum. That saying, that old timeless saying, it takes a village, I believe is so critically important, particularly in this context. So the first is this piece about relationships. Especially in that example I just gave about two kindergarten students, right? Who just come in on the first day of school, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, or maybe not, because maybe they have different experiences or feelings about starting school based on what they think school is, whether they experience pre-K or whatnot. It's our responsibility as educators, right, to again meet them where they are, not only academically, but also socially and emotionally, to provide them with a sense of safety and welcome and nurturing, so that they can be invited to engage in that classroom community and in their learning process. Because if I'm even at that young age, if I perceive that my peers know more than me, I might be timid to actively engage in my learning process. I might shut down. I might feel too vulnerable. And so cultivating that relationship, I think, is truly foundational. It is a must have in order for students to be able to realize their full potential academically, is them feeling safe to experience the learning process with their guide and shepherd, the teacher. And I think that those relationships a lot of times are left to chance. And you just kind of hope, well, teachers, they love kids. They wouldn't be a teacher if they didn't love kids. So I'm sure that they, build a relationship with all the kids. And I think that's, a bit naive. And there's a lot of intentional practices we can do to help facilitate the development and formation of those relationships, and to ensure that in a classroom that might have 30 kids in it, yes, maybe that teacher artfully connects with 26 of them just by virtue of who they are, but those other four, right? How do we make sure they're reached too? So that to your piece about kind of the book All In, and this idea of bringing the whole self and having that foundational culture and as an inroads to achievement, I think is critical. And the other piece, I think a direct connection, is this idea of partnering with families. Because to have an all-in culture, you literally have to engage staff, students, and family, everybody united on a common mission in service of a common vision, playing an integral role toward the achievement of the students. And so, again, to play off that same example, families might not know what resources would be just right for their child at that level in kindergarten, right? As a parent myself, I have a 2-year-old, and I really kind of have no idea exactly what she needs right now at this stage in her life, despite being an early childhood educator, right? Because it's a different time and age. And so I think, really working together so that the best practices for students to grow and learn are being promoted, not only during the school day, but also at home, and that families feel confident and invited to engage in that process, as opposed to intimidated because they don't know how they teach addition anymore, because 20 years ago they used a different algorithm. Like, even I feel that way, being 10 years removed from being a math teacher in the classroom myself. Maybe there's a different strategy that's more effective now. And so inviting them in to really be part of it, I think, is just, again, helps cultivate that sense of all in, everybody on the same page. And those are the 1% solutions that are going to actually start to close that opportunity gap. So that was my long-winded reflection. And I saw Dr. Estrella joined us, so maybe she can opine.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So we're now joined by Dr. Alexander Estrella, who is the superintendent of Norwalk Public Schools and has worked reviewing equity and disproportionality, special education, school facilities, and the overall structure of the district. So again, we're talking about equity versus accountability. And Dr. Estrella, we would love to get kind of your input on this important topic.
So I think I'll start off by saying that a lot of times people misconstrued the idea that by creating opportunities for equity, we are lowering our expectations around setting standards of accountability and excellence. As a superintendent, one of the things that I have strategically done here in my district has been really rethink what our organizational structure looked like and ensure that in our redesign of our organization, a table of organization, we set up a structure where we have someone supporting the work of equity, excellence, and inclusion in a role that allowed all departments to have an expectation or standard of accountability around the work. So my deputy superintendent is the person who alongside me works to ensure that we set structures within our organization that enable all students to have access to a great learning experience. And that as we look at our curricula and learning opportunities, we are ensuring that when we're designing the work, that we're keeping all students in mind, and also that we have individuals in the organization that represent the students that we're serving. So I've been extremely intentional, not only in reframing my table of organization, but also in thinking about who are the people that sit in the table and how those people, making sure that those people represent the student body that I'm serving.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So I guess my question, and if you are on the call and you have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, or you can always post your questions in the chat and I can relay those for you. I guess my biggest question is, did you find that this topic of equity versus accountability became a broader topic in light of some of the most recent events in the United States over maybe the past few years? Or has this been kind of an ongoing thing that's been a passion project for you? I'll start with Dr. Estrella.
So this work has been part of the paradigm of my practice beyond what's happening nationally. It has been part of my work since I entered education. I started my work in education with the mission of wanting to serve children that looked like me, because there were not enough people that looked like me in the field, particularly because my background originally was chemistry and biology, and just making sure that they had role models that they could see themselves in and that they can aspire to be, was really critical for me. So in thinking about the work, this has been part of what I have focused on as a teacher, as a coach, as a principal, and a superintendent within my district. We were talking about closing the opportunity gap, even the digital gap, early on in my career, because I saw those as critical components of ensuring that the opportunity gap was narrowed down for the communities that I was serving. I think the digital gap now has closed significantly, and we have to thank the pandemic for that. But when we look at it, it's not just about the hardware, it's also about broadband connectivity and creating opportunities for students where even if they were limited in terms of the resources they had at home, that they could have free broadband connectivity. And that was work that I was doing as a principal early on, before the word became popular.
that's fantastic. I love that. And, you know, I think that's so important. You touched on something that is very near and dear to my heart about making sure that there's a seat at the table for people who look like you, because I do think that's so important. So I want to turn it over to Kelsey, where you might have had a little bit of a different experience. I know you came from a school district that was one of the lower economic school districts, but then you also worked in charter schools. So can you tell me maybe how your experience was the same or different than Dr. Estrella's experience?
I think, well, similar in the fact, certainly, that it's always been part of the narrative. It's literally the reason for many charter schools, and certainly ours, the reason that it was founded is because there was this notable gap in opportunity for students. The scores in the district were dismal, and they weren't improving. And so that was the call for, innovative models to try to address some of that. And I think, so I think it hasn't necessarily changed in that way, but I do think on a national scale, the consciousness has been raised to others, because whereas before these gaps were most prominent, right, in lower income communities, certainly amongst people of color, as Dr. Estrella alluded to, like there's now because the pandemic has led to an actual achievement gap, perhaps not an opportunity gap, for students across lines of difference and across economic classes, et cetera. There might be more families and just members of society who are aware for the first time of how prevalent this challenge is. And we're wondering, right, like if nationally most second graders are not actually at a second grade level as a result of the pandemic, are we going to systematically hold them back, for example? That's like a conversation that many parents have had the privilege of never having to actually consider for their own child, whereas many of the families that were able to work with in the Bronx did have to wrestle with those considerations, and wondering to what extent kind of the bar of proficiency was going to make meaningful impositions on their life and their families. And so I do think in some ways it has made the conversation a bit broader and more in the public conscious.
Sure. And that's actually great. I guess my next question would be for you guys. And again, if you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. But I think my next question for both of you would just be, what would be your practical advice when somebody is struggling with that? I mean, we do know that, historically, there are people who don't have seats at the table that they're economically disadvantaged, or they're Black, brown, or Asian, like BBA, or they're women, or, LGBTQ, those sorts of things. We know that all of those are disadvantaged and tend to be disenfranchised. So I guess my question would be, for those educators that are out there who want to make sure that we are not only being equitable, but we are holding ourselves accountable to that. How do we do that? What is a practical step that we can take to make sure that we are being inclusive? Dr. Estrella, would you start us off with that?
I think first and foremost, in order for us to do that, we have to always ensure that we're thinking about the whole and all of its parts, and making sure that when we're looking at the work, we're taking into consideration who we have in front of us that we need to serve, and what does it take to really serve everyone well. And that goes from serving our young men of color who have been disproportionately served, not well, actually, by our systems, looking at our children who need specialized services. What does learning look like for them, where we are ensuring that we are providing them access to all the standards and the work that entails in a way where they get the scaffolds that they need, but that the information or resources are not dumbed down to the point where they're not accessing the work at the level that they are required to. And even when looking at students of diverse language backgrounds, that we honor where they come from, the language that they speak at home, but also celebrate their genius, and making sure that within that, despite what their language obstacles at the moment may be, that doesn't mean that they are incapable of accessing the work and engaging in the learning. So when thinking about the work, we have to think about what are some of the systemic structures that are inhibiting every child to be successful, and our responsibility is to ensure that we reframe those systems so that they produce the outcomes that we are expecting. Because I tell my team, our system produce the outcomes that they are intended to produce, and the only way that we can change it is by reanalyzing our systems and reframing them in a manner that ensures that all students are successful. And that's, to me, the biggest form of accountability that you can have.
Thank you for that. So Kelsey, one quick question before we get to you on that, because we did have a question in the chat, and I definitely want to make sure we have time for other people's questions other than just mine. We had the question, what training and resources are available to teachers and school administrators who need support in this area? So we'll kick it off with you, Kelsey, and then we'll go to you, Dr. Estrella.
I can't ramble off specific, like, I guess I would put them into categories and buckets. I think because this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusivity is transcendent in a way, I think, beyond even how some people think about it. And so having, to what Dr. Estrella alluded to, a department actually diverting intentional resources in the form of staff, in the form of trainings, in the form of time, so that students who are not being given the tools and resources they need to flourish and be successful have specific people championing them, I think is one of the critical pieces. So that would be my first, like, concrete step, is who on your campus or school, for whom is this their number one priority, that they're constantly paying attention to it, and that they're looking at the data. Because I think that's the answer to the question of, how do we hold ourselves accountable to it? We don't just focus on the inputs. We don't make these kind of broad sweeping, okay, we're going to try to hire, X type of teachers, or we're going to put some of these systems in place, or we're going to have a tutoring block for these kids. It can't just be about the inputs. It actually has to be looking at the outputs and the data to back it up, and then taking the cuts of the data that will really tell the story. So again, what Dr. Estrella alluded to, right? That, boys of color have been disproportionately expelled, have challenged different academic outcomes when you look on a bunch of indicators. And so what are we doing about that? How are you looking at your individual campus and saying, is that same story true at our schools? And if it is, then what are we actually concretely doing about it? And I would say it starts with having champions and people who are really have expertise to lend to whatever group it is, or groups, or different, skill sets, whatever, at your schools that need those extra additional access points to be able to meet the standards.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And Dr. Estrella, what about you?
So I always have the approach that I always start with the leadership first, in terms of building their capacity around the work, because they are the ones that will continue to scaffold the work within the school building. So a lot of what we've done is build principal capacity in terms of understanding what implicit bias is, understanding what disproportionality looks like. How do we look at data points within our organization, and how those data points inform our practice, and kind of like put in front of people a mirror of where we're moving our students or not within the organization, and what are the things that we need to do better. With that, we also incorporate teacher training around implicit bias and helping people look at what do they bring to the classroom that might be inhibiting their ability to access or have positive outcomes for all students within the organization, and particularly their classrooms. And we've established ambassadors within each of our buildings, equity teams, to really continuously inform practice and support teachers within the organization at large through professional development that then are further developed within the schools with the support of the equity team and ambassadors within the building. But I think that it's critical to start off with the data, allowing people to look at themselves in the mirror, analyze what they bring to the table, what are the processes that are currently in place, and what are the things that need to shift as a result of certain outcomes that are becoming recidivist within the organization, whether it's disproportionality around suspension, disproportionality around access to AP or honors courses for certain groups of students, and making sure that when looking at these patterns and trends, we are honing into what are the systematic structures that are leading to that, how do we make those shifts, and in the process also scaffolding training to build people's capacity and awareness around the things that they need to personally work on to improve so that we achieve better outcomes for children.
Thank you so much for that. So we do have another question, and that is, are there any federal funds that you know of that can be used to support the resources that may be needed to resolve these challenges? So I will, I don't know who wants to take that one first, but I'm going to start with Dr. Estrella, because you're still green on my screen.
I'll start. So we haven't tapped into federal dollars to engage in this work, but what I have done is tapped into a lot of philanthropic dollars. So I've engaged the philanthropic community around this conversation. We've spoken about the importance of doing this work because I'm a firm believer that if all children within our community succeed, then our community thrives. So we have prefaced the importance of this work. One, in building a strong data team within the central office that will streamline information to all of our schools so that everyone is well informed of where we are as an organization. And then secondly, getting philanthropic dollars to build and resource the professional development that needs to happen to build capacity within the organization around these different elements. And even getting resources and funding to establish a study, which we did with Temple University, around the current state of the district around this conversation of equity, right? Where are we? How are some of the communities that have been underserved faring out within the organization or not? And we utilized that study to build a frame around the conversations we were having with our philanthropic community, and we have become well resourced through that avenue to continue to engage in this work.
I love the fact that you mentioned engaging the community, because I think that's so important to your point. When the students thrive, then the community thrives. And so I totally love that idea. Kelsey, what about you? What resources do you have that help to resolve these challenges?
From a funding standpoint, certainly as it relates to special populations, students with disabilities, multi-language learners, there are a couple funding buckets. I don't want to misspeak and get the acronyms wrong, but I believe at both the state and the federal levels, based on the designations from the Committee on Special Education, and in order to provide additional services that will help students be able to access the curriculum. And so, and there's actually quite a dearth of resources in that way, particularly in that piece. As it relates to the diversity, equity, inclusivity piece, I'm not aware of explicit federal funding in that regard. But to Dr. Estrella's point, I think that's something that is really elevated in public conscious, and therefore there have been more philanthropic opportunities to tap into people who really want to see this work flourish at schools and ask them for the gift. We actually, Brilla engaged with a consultant in this manner and found her expertise to be really valuable to help us, shape how we were thinking about reaching not only all of our student populations, but also all of our staff. Again, to this idea of being all in, it can't just be some people or the people who are inherently bought into what you're doing, but really, taking those extra steps to truly accept the gifts of every member of your school community and help them to be able to bring their full selves to contribute to your vision. So I think keeping the staff focused as well, again, to Dr. Estrella's point, I think is really critical, because it is through staff that we're able to reach students.
Well, and I love that, because even though we're not talking about maybe federal resources, I firmly believe in the concept of if you build it, they will come, right? And so I think part of engaging the community and getting the community involved and engaged and on board with this idea, we may see at some point that there may be federal support just because of the momentum of this movement. And so I love that. I think that's fantastic. We have 3 minutes left. Feel free, again, if you have any questions, you can come off of mute or post those in the chat. But I think where I would like to end is I would just like to ask again, this is the question I always ask at the end of a session like this, is that if you could give one piece of practical advice, just a takeaway, what can we do today when we hang up from this call to really make movement and momentum with this topic? What would that be? So I'm going to start again with Dr. Estrella.
So I think that it depends on the role that you currently hold and the locus of control you have within the organization to enable change. But I think every member of an organization is able to do their part in thinking about what is your work, what are the things that are critical components of your work that can lend themselves to improving outcomes and the well-being of all students, and thinking about more of a holistic approach of who are you serving, what are their needs, and making sure that in the scope of your work, you're constantly asking the question of what can I do to ensure that everyone within my organization is well served, and what is the outcome that I'm hoping to see for the children that I'm serving, and work backwards from that in terms of what are the things that I need to do in order to be that piece of the pie that enables that to happen.
Thank you. That is phenomenal advice. And Kelsey, what about you?
Yeah, I would piggyback. And when I was speaking about my book, the same question was asked, that you have to start from the beginning, which is to dream in detail. And I think that's to Dr. Stray's point, which it's not starting with solutions. Oh, this tutoring program. Oh, we'll do this anti-bias training. Oh, it's pausing and asking yourself, what would it really look like for all staff members to be well served by our model, for all kids to be well served by our model? And only once you have that vision, then should you start to take the steps to engage other members of your school community in the process of figuring out the just right steps for execution. And that, I think that's the best chance for success.
That's fantastic. Those were amazing tips, and I really appreciate both of you guys sharing. We are just right at 1:30, and I just want to close by saying I really appreciate you guys sharing your experience. This is a topic that I think is pretty timely and really near and dear to a lot of people's hearts. So I want to thank you very much for sharing your passion and your vision and your tips for moving forward. And I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today with Dr. Estrella and Kelsey. And you guys have a great rest of your day.
You too. Stay well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicole.